Our anticipation of tonight is the anticipation of reading from a shared text. Haggadah literally means the telling. And I want to talk just a little bit about the evolution of the Haggadah and the illuminated Haggadah. But first, the command of tonight's Seder. We're told in Exodus chapter 13, Shivat Yamim Tochel Matzot, 7 days you shall eat matzot, matzahs, Uvayom Hashvi'i Chag Ladonai, and the 7th day is a celebration to God. Matzot Yachel et Shivat Yamim, you will eat those matzahs 7 days. V'lo yer elecha chametz, but you will not see any chametz, any leavened within. V'lo yer elecha she'or b'chol gavucha. You shall not see any of that leaven within your boundaries. And now the key verse, verse 8. V'higadeta levincha, and you shall tell your children, bayom hahu, on that day, lemor, saying, Ba'avur zeh, on account of this, asa Adonai li, which God did for me, b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, in my going out from Egypt. And so that key word, vihigadata, and you shall tell your children, and then the sense that what is it you tell your children? You tell them it was on account of this, what God did for me in my going out. Now, again, that is first in the context of Moses talking to the Israelites who had gone out, but is understood by our sages when we tell at the Seder the story, we are to tell it as if we, each of us, went out from the land of Egypt. We have a Haggadah to guide us in the telling of that story, but do know that the obligation to tell the story is on parents to their children, or for people to tell each other, not necessarily to read the text that we are given. Like the Maxwell House Haggadah you can get at many stores for free. That is a traditional text that unfolded over time. The first presentation of the laws of the telling are already in Israel in the Mishnah, recorded by Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince, at about the year 200, based on conversations of the rabbis, and there'll be excerpts in our Haggadah from the Mishnah. So, for instance, Rabbi Gamliel, one of the great teachers of the early centuries of the Common Era, will say, what is it you need to have at your table? Matzah, Morah, and Pesach. The matzah, the bitter herbs, and of an earlier time, his recollection of having had that barbecued lamb, which we don't have since the destruction of the temple. And so that's an example of our Haggadah, our telling, including that earliest layer after the Bible of describing how we would celebrate our Seder, quoting Rabban Gamliel, or taken also a description of Rabbi Akiva, a rabbi of the 1st and 2nd centuries, and how he would tell on that particular night of Passover the story until early in the morning when the students would come and say, it's time for the Shema, the sun has come out. And you might wonder, in that also piece of Mishnah that's part of our Haggadah, why there was a need for guards, the students out front. And that's because Rabbi Akiva would be one of those who plotted the rebellion against Rome. Of a later date, in which in reading the story of freedom, there was a contemporizing, a politicizing of the tale. so that the leaders of the day spent all night talking about how to achieve freedom. For the story, the Haggadah, the telling is not only of the past, but calls on each of us in our own time and in our own way to make the liberation of Egypt a responsibility of the moment to enable freedom, whether our own or the freedom of others. And so it was in the first Siddur of Rabbi Amram Gaon and Rabbi Sadia Gaon, the patriarch teachers of Babylonia in the 9th century, who in the first Siddur, first prayer book, that they sent to the Jews of Spain who had asked, what should our prayer book look like? In that prayer book, one of the little units was the Passover Seder, the Haggadah. And it would take another century or two for the Haggadah to be extracted as a separate booklet, a book. Mind you, this is pre-printing press. The Haggadah was written by hand for the prayer Haggadah leader to conduct the Seder, the order of the telling of the story. And the Haggadah, as it would unfold, would be a telling of 4 acts, each purposeful. And in the Magid, the telling, there would be 4 different ways of telling the story, each beginning with questions and answer and then praise. 4 different dimensions of the experience of going out from Egypt. The first, Avadim Hayinu, we were physically enslaved. The second, a description of how Terach, Abraham's father, was an idolater, and how we as a people emerged from idolatry to a belief in God and God's caring, liberating presence. The third telling, the eating, and the fourth, a whole set of midrashim, rabbinic imaginings that assume that the reader knows the story and is saying, wow, how amazing that there weren't just 10 plagues, it was as if there were 50 plagues or 100 plagues. And so Haggadah, the telling, emerged. One last piece that I would like to share, and that is how the telling became not just words, but pictures. That too was an unfolding that would take time. In the beginning, they were just words. And the Jews who lived in Baghdad in those years, they were Jews living in a Muslim country. And in Islam, as Muhammad understood the teachings, there were to be no pictorial representations, which is why if you go into a mosque, there are no pictures, but there is sometimes this beautiful, elaborate calligraphy. Likewise, there were magnificent Haggadot that had beautiful calligraphy of the letters, and some of those earliest found Haggadot. Jews often take in the culture around them. And so the Jews living in Muslim countries tended also, and those were the early years, not to have illuminated text. But Jews living in countries like Germany, northern parts of Spain that were Christian, and Italy later on, were living in cultures in which the Bible was being illuminated. It was a lot of expense and a lot of work to illuminate an entire Bible, but the Haggadah, the Passover telling, that was short and more. The goal of that telling was for the leader, for the adults, to often tell the children the story. And that led to the unfolding of illuminated texts of the Haggadah, particularly by Ashkenazic Jews, actually even earlier, by the Jews of Spain living in Christian settings. Among the earliest of those Haggadot is one that is popularly called the Sarajevo Haggadah. That's because it was found in Sarajevo. Remarkably, its story is quite recent. In 1894, in Sarajevo, which was then the capital of Bosnia, a young boy named Cohen, who was from a local family whose father had died and had become impoverished, brought an ancient Haggadah that had pictures. It was illuminated, and he needed to support his family. And the only valuable possession that had been with their family for generations was this illuminated Haggadah. And it was eventually, in a short time, purchased by the National Museum of Bosnia, there in Sarajevo. And because it was in a public setting for the first time, knowledge of it began to spread. Mind you, this was 1894. And at that time, most Jews who would have been asked did not know that there were illuminated texts. Because most of these illuminated manuscripts had been, like this one as it would be shown, was 14th, 15th, 16th century. They were rare and not widely known or seen. And as a result of the Sarajevo Haggadah, which then became publicized, other manuscripts also began to emerge. And it became evident from more than I have time to share now, that the Sarajevo Haggadah had been written in Spain, probably 100 some years before the Jews were expelled from Spain, and that there was a tradition of illumination. It meant commissioning an artist, which could take a lot of money and a lot of time. Some of these illuminated Haggadot were wedding gifts, interestingly, of a groom to a bride. They would include, at times, a drawing, a portrait of the bride toward the end of the Haggadah. It would be a symbol of family, of the prayer of having children to gather around the Seder table. So the first thing that's interesting to know in my little sharing in anticipation of our Seders is that the Haggadah is an anthology, beginning with, of course, the Bible, the early rabbis of the Mishnah, and then a whole history of the rabbis of Babylonia, creating that first guide of Haggadot, then unfolding, and then Jews personalizing in time with illumination. But that was a radical move, or at least a controversial move. Controversial in that the command of the Ten Commandments, and you shall make no graven images of anything above or below, as I shared, for some, as in Islam, meant no portraiture, which is why among the most famous Haggadot of Germany, of those early Haggadot of the 14th century, is called the Bird's Head Haggadah, in which all the figures have beaks. So as to say, when it says, you shall make no graven images of anything above or below that exists on the earth, one halachic way around that was to say, well, there is nothing on the earth that looks like this, a human with a beak. And so that was a workaround. But in the Sarajevo Haggadah, they are fully human figures, which is to say other rabbis understood that command, which is our nature. We debate the law. To say, where the figures are part of the text, where the drawings are to illuminate our understanding of the story, to provide a midrash, that is not idolatry, that is celebration of Torah and learning. And so Haggadot have a history. And I just, in looking over this famous Haggadah of Sarajevo, wanted to point out how we also learn from the illuminations of Midrashim that once existed. And we don't have the written text, but we do have pictures, and they are repeated in other Spanish Haggadot, which is to say, it was a popular folk telling. And here's something to get a little chilled over. The 10th plague of the Bichorim, as it's written underneath it, are people who are dead with bats sucking their blood, apparently, at their mouth. So do know, fear of bats as the source of the final plague are an ancient part of our tradition. I don't know if you can see it. You have to look online at the Sarajevo rendition, but you'll take my word for it because it's pretty small, of these 5 bats here on the page. Well, I'm going to now move forward and pull this together. Here we are on camera with me coming to you from our synagogue into your homes. We just shared a celebration of Torah reading and Haftarah and prayers from our Irvine Park, recorded and then so remarkably put together to give us that quality of immediacy. That too is something that has evolved over this last year. And again, I pause to celebrate Amy Robinson Katz and Ari Katz and their respective talents, and Amy's talent for pulling all this together technologically. Much growth. That too, for me, has been an adjustment during the year halachically. A response to Sha'ah Dechak, the exigency of the hour, an immediate need of keeping community here of Congregation B'nai Israel connected, so that this morning we could see our members reading and chanting. That was our pride. You know, before COVID, we would have annually 180 different Torah readers every year in our community. That was our sign of who we were. And so, not unlike the need and the opportunity in Jewish history for enhancing the Haggadah with illumination and enhancing the telling by personalization, our Seder, our telling, our text has evolved. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, as we gather tonight, we are still in Sha'ah Dechak. We are still in an exigent times in which we do not, when we open our door and say all who come in and eat, can't indeed do that because we're not sure that all who would come in would necessarily be vaccinated, or even if they were vaccinated, we're not quite sure what all the rules are. We are still in transition. But we do so reading the Haggadah, linking ourselves to generations past that point to the future, a world of liberation, a world in which there is gathering and celebration. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, may we harvest tonight the goodness of legacy. May we also harvest hope as part of celebration that next year, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, next year, even if not in Jerusalem, then in our own homes, with our doors open wide to all who would wish to come in and eat and celebrate. Amen.